morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this BitcoinCash difficulty adjustment algorithm developer meeting. Today we have invited leaders in the field to discuss large BitcoinCash block confirmation time variance, possible solutions, and the work being done. For those that are unfamiliar with the future of BitcoinCash and our work, I will start with a short introduction. My name is David R. Allen, and with my partner, I've been working to help people, mostly developers, communicate since 2013. Our known projects include the series online on-chain scaling conferences in 2016, the Future of Bitcoin.com conference in Arnhem a month before the BitcoinCash forked off the main chain, main Bitcoin chain, and since then we have rebranded as the Future of BitcoinCash and have been helping with communication between groups and individuals. We've also been organizing regular and more subject-focused public meetings like this meeting today. Most of our time in Bitcoin, now BitcoinCash, we have been doing our work in the background. Recently, I have become more public about my support for BitcoinCash and support for the people who are actually doing the work. The reason for organizing today's meeting is a clear and renewed interest in solving issues with changing mining strategies that are causing unpredictable and at times very slow confirmation times for users. These strategies also reduce profitability for miners that are using mining strategies which are more beneficial for users of the BitcoinCash network. We have seen a lot of discussion in different places, and with less than 1 month until the feature freeze date, it was time to call this meeting. So that's my introduction. The rules of engagement for this meeting, pretty straightforward. The code of conduct was set up for the work group initially, and disruptive behaviors are prohibited. Non-constructive criticism, name-calling, speaking over others, intentional deception, posturing, or otherwise inciting conflict, and otherwise being disruptive to professional discussion. And, you know, we're dealing with adults here, so I don't think there's going to be any problem in that area. So we're going to start in a second with introductions, which will include your name, background, current work, and interest in the subject. We're going to try and limit that to 1 minute each. And then the primary discussion items are going to be, or as laid out in this draft agenda, 1, the problem, why is a change needed? 2, what needs to change and what needs to remain the same? 3, possible solutions. 4, cost to the ecosystem of doing the change or not doing the change, and 5, conclusions. I'm hoping we get to number 7, which is calls to action, and then if required, we'll set up a further meeting to go further with this. So I'd like to start off with introductions, and I'm going to just work from my top left in a circular way. My top left right now is Antony Zegers. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm Antony Zegers. I work on Bitcoin ABC. I didn't really, I guess in terms of difficulty related stuff, just my background in that area is like basically since right when BitcoinCash was originally forked in August 1st of 2017, I basically realized that the difficulty algorithm was a problem originally. So I've basically since then I've been interested in all the different solutions and looked at all the work being done. So I've pretty much been following it, and I guess my goal is to help find something that can, like solutions to these problems that can actually be deployed and help get them towards something, you know, that everyone can agree on and that we can actually like implement. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you very much, Antony. My top right is Jacob Eliosoff, and I apologize ahead of time if I say your name incorrectly.
No problem. Yeah, Jacob Eliosoff here. I run a small crypto fund, crypto investment fund, and I have an interest in algorithms in general and DAA in particular. I've been following that since, I guess, late 2017. And I'm not a hands-on developer in the Bitcoin Cash community, but I have been digging at the DAs for a while, so I'll share my opinions on that.
Great, thank you, Jacob. Next, I have Amaury Sechet. Will you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Amaury Sechet. I'm a lead developer of Bitcoin ABC.
Thank you. The next I have, I'm going to say it wrong. How about if I just say George and you say your last name?
Sure, George Bissias. I'm a researcher at UMass Amherst. Along with some other people, I've authored a couple papers that may or may not be relevant here. They've been mentioned in regard to the DAA, bobtail, and bonded mining. So that's kind of, I think, why I was asked to attend today in case anybody has any questions about those protocols and how they may relate to fixing the DAA going forward.
That's great. Thank you very much, George. It's good to see you again. Next, I have Jonathan Toomim.
Hi, Jonathan Toomim here. I work on a few different Bitcoin-related topics, especially scaling stuff. But about a year ago, I started to see a lot of complaints on Reddit about people taking a long time to have their transactions get confirmed. So this became a topic of interest for me for that reason.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that. Chris Pacia.
Yeah, I'm Chris. I work on BCHD.
Doesn't get much more simple than that. Next, we have Karol. I won't try your last name.
Okay, I'm Karol Trzeszczkowski, known as Licho, and I am a mathematical physicist and Bitcoin Cash developer. I got interested in DAA because of the underlying problems, like the fundamental underlying problems that are connected with mining and how mining is done. Well, I might have got some insight on this, but yeah, maybe I'll be helpful here.
Okay, thank you very much, Karol. I appreciate that. Nice to see you again as well. Scott Roberts, which I believe you have another name. It's up to you if you want to say who you are.
Yeah, I'm Scott Roberts, known as Zowie on the internet. I'm known for working on difficulty algorithms and having a massive set of GitHub issues that I think maybe everyone here has seen. I'm also interested in consensus and very interested in a double notarization scheme to allow small coins to get Bitcoin chain work imported directly onto their chains so that they can stop double spending attacks.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We actually did hear...
I should apologize for my internet connection. It looks like it's really slow.
That's fine. Actually, I believe that we heard all the words, and I appreciate you speaking slowly so that we've got the gist of what you were saying. So thank you, Scott, and welcome. I want to move on to Josh Ellithorpe.
Hello, everybody. I'm Josh Ellithorpe. I work on BCHD. I also am an engineer at Coinbase, where I see support issues that revolve around confirmation times, and therefore I'm really interested in potential solutions for the massive range of possible confirmation times currently happening on BitcoinCash.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that. Next, we have Freetrader. I'm just going to read how Freetrader does his introduction. He's had it prepared, so that's great. Hi, I'm Freetrader, software developer involved with Bitcoin Cash for a while and currently lead maintainer at BCHN, one of the few pseudonymous developers. The BCHN client project is strongly interested in seeing the DAA improve to make a better user experience on Bitcoin Cash. Thank you for that introduction, Freetrader. And I'd like to move on to the next item, which is the acceptance of the agenda. You've all had a chance to look at it. I'm doing it in slightly reverse order, but the primary discussion items that we have laid out, is there anyone that has any objection to that format for those 5 items? I'm hearing none. And Freetrader says agenda okay for me. So that's a good start. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that you guys have all made the time to come to this meeting. So without any further ado, I think I'm going to throw it open for discussion of the problem. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch for hands when you want to talk. And Scott, that'll just mean you turning your video on again when you want to talk. So could I get an indication of who would like to open? I have Jonathan Toomim's hand up, so please go ahead.
I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you guys a little bit of data. The way I see it, the problem that we have is that since the most recent change in the difficulty adjustment algorithm on November 13th, 2017, we've been getting this oscillation pattern in hash rate and also in difficulty from the miners. And that oscillation pattern has been regular with a 24.5-hour period. It's been approximately 146 or 147 blocks in length. And basically every day, every 24.5 hours, the same pattern in hash rate that happened 1 day ago repeats itself with a little bit of mutation. This has been going on basically since the day the difficulty algorithm was forked in, but it wasn't actually that bad, wasn't that extreme in amplitude until around October of 2019, when in October 2019, we believe a different pool started to engage in a behavior known as switch mining, which is where they switch between BTC and BCH based on which one is more profitable at that moment. And so that change in miner behavior caused a large change in the amplitude of these oscillations. These oscillations are problematic for users because they result in long periods in which the hash rate is low, block intervals are low, and confirmation times are long. They also cause problems for security because they create an incentive for doing selfish mining, which can cause reorg of the chain and can cause transactions to get double spent, either accidentally or intentionally. And it also causes some problems in the mining ecosystem in which miners who are loyal to BCH are actually actively penalized, unintentionally, but actively penalized for their loyalty and for their consistent hash rate. And there are a few other side aspects to the problem, but those are the main ones.
That's great, Jonathan. Thank you for bringing that forward and being the first one to speak to the issue. Could I get you to stop sharing your screen for a minute, just so that we can see everybody? I'd also like to just sort of go around and see who would like to comment on this first introduction by Jonathan. Amaury?
Yeah, so I agree with most of what Jonathan said, but I think like if we want to do things proper, we need to start with the problem statement. And Jonathan is like, okay, here is the data with the DAA. And then you flow the problem from that. And the problem is that when you do it that way, you bake the solution into your problem statement. So I think you stated those, but I think there are 2 main problem statements that we want to address. One is unreliable confirmation time. Actually, I think there are 3, but there are 2 that Jonathan stated. So the first one is unreliable confirmation time, which impact users that want to transact on the chain because they don't know, they don't know where the transaction is going to be mined and secured. The second one is about miner incentives. So as Jonathan pointed, miner incentives are not ideal because right now steady miners are penalized versus switch miners. And that means that, like someone that steady mine BCH all the time is going to be less profitable than someone that mines it a lot when it's easy to do so and doesn't mine it when it's harder to do so. And so as a result, it create a perverse incentive, right? In an ideal system, you would want the exact opposite. You would want miners that are dedicated to BCH to like make more than miners that are more opportunistic, if in the if that was possible. And so the third problem, I think Jonathan did not mention that problem, but I think there is a third problem that is worth considering. It's that various DAA that we had in the past do drift, and which means that they do about one block every 10 minutes, but they don't exactly do that actually. And so over a long period of time, you see that there are more or less coins that are emitted, and it's hard to predict how many of them are actually going to be emitted. So for anyone that is interested in the hard money property of BCH, that's an issue, because you would want to be able to predict how many coins there are going to be in circulation at any point in time. So I think that's the three problems that we want to address. So that last one is best addressed by changing the DA, that's for sure, because the DA is what regulates the emission of blocks. The first one do benefit greatly from the DA, but I think are not completely solved by this. So this is why I think it's important to start from the problem. So to get back confirmation time. So if we change the DA, and assuming we can make something that is like mathematically perfect, the most perfect things ever, that is probably not doable in practice, but let's assume that we live in mathematical theory for 1 minute. The best that we can do is guarantee people that their transaction is going to be confirmed in 600 seconds or 10 minutes on average, with like the absolute perfect DAA. And well, if you put yourself in the shoe of the user, that's probably not enough. That's better, like the lower is better, but 10 minutes is not lower. We want to be in the few seconds time range. And the second issue with mining incentives, same stuff. Like any DAA that you roll out will always see the switch miner have an edge over the steady miner. Though the better the DAA, the smaller that edge, right? So we can try to reduce that edge by implementing a better DA, but it's always going to exist, and so we cannot really solve the problem definitively that way. Though we can improve the situation.
Thank you, Amaury. What I've done is I put down those three items in the chat, and maybe we'll stay with discussion of that. So, who would like to speak next?
I have one other item that I'd like to add to that, is that the current DAA is aggravating other chain features that our customers and users find valuable. In our last hard fork, we increased the chain transaction limit to 50 transactions. And the DAA has a direct repercussion to that has nothing to do with the confirmation time argument that was presented by Amaury. So when we see 3 hours between blocks or 2 hours between blocks, the extension to 50 chain transactions doesn't help Satoshi Dice and other services that needed 50 chain transactions within approximately a 10-minute time frame. So I think that this is something that needs to be included in the problem statement, unless we do not believe that that chained limit is important.
Thank you, Josh. I've added that as number 4 on the list here, and if there's more specific things you want to add to number 4, please put them in. My technical expertise is limited. So next, who would like to speak to this?
Yeah, no, Josh is right. And it's not just going to be the chain transaction limit. It's any kind of per block limit that you're more likely to run into. So it may be the SIGOPS limit or even the block size if we get way more transactions.
Exactly.
If you have high variance, you're going to bump into those limits way easier. And so making the block emission more steady is effectively equivalent to raising those limits, even though we don't raise them.
Is there anyone who disagrees with the 4 problem statements that have been put forward? Well, it seems we have agreement on the first item for discussion. Scott, go ahead, sir.
I would like to make a comment on that. Assuming we want to keep the regular exponential distribution of solve times, it seems like you can't do better than keeping your confirmation times and average solve time correct. If those 2 are kept accurate, then it seems like it solves that 4th issue, or it addresses it as much as we want to without going into anything extreme.
Does everyone hear Scott enough to understand what he's saying?
Not very well.
To be honest, I think it might be better for him to type or turn off his video.
Yeah, he's turned off his video. That didn't seem to make a big difference. The other option is to call in, but unfortunately that takes extra time. Scott, would you mind just typing? I know it's a lot of extra work, but if you don't mind just typing in your comment, I don't mind reading it.
So in the meantime, maybe I'll comment while Scott is typing. So maybe I'll comment. So, well, as I understand, the problem with we are about to address is that basically the job of difficulty adjustment is to figure out how much hash rate is working on the chain. So the current DAA is being tricked to think that there is this number is different, and I think this is a fundamental issue, like a fundamental issue that maybe should be addressed.
Not so sure that it's being tricked about the hash rate being different, as the current DAA is looking at the wrong time interval. The current DAA is doing a very good job of estimating the average hash rate over the last 144 blocks. It's just that the last 144 blocks is not a very good indicator of the current hash rate. And like the oscillation problem that we're getting is because the current hash rate and the last 144 blocks are not conceptually the same thing. And there's a deterministic oscillation that happens as a result of that mismatch.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. When like a spike is leaving this window, like when the hash rate spike is leaving the window of 144 blocks, the DAA interprets this like just moving away from this event as the hash rate drops. So it effectively is tricked into thinking that there was a hash rate drop while there was not, right? So I interpret it this way, and maybe that's a useful interpretation.
I'm just going to read out a couple of comments. One that came from Scott, which was, if we're going to keep an exponential distribution, then optimizing 1 and 3 automatically is the optimal solution for 4. I just wanted to make sure that Scott's comment was there.
Definitely agree with that.
Thank you, Josh. The second item is now from Freetrader, who says, I agree with Jonathan. The current DAA has an oscillation problem. I think most here are clear about that from previous discussions. Anyone want to clarify their position on that?
Yeah, not really clarified, but I want to explain why the original DAA is the way it is. And I think with a recent discussion I had with Jonathan, I think one of the constraints that we had when creating this original DAA has changed since then, and that's one of the reasons we can do better. I don't know how much people are familiar with selfish mining, but I assume like at least everybody in this group should be if you're in this meeting. But basically the idea is that you're going to mine a chain in secret on your own on the side and not publish the block. And then you're going to strategically publish the block depending on what the rest of the people are doing. And you can do so in a way such as it's advantageous for you. And so there is one parameter when you modelize that behavior that is called gamma that some believe can be negative, but it's usually more like between 0 and 1, as most probabilities are. And this is effectively the probability if there is a race between the selfish miner and another miner to publish their block. There is a race between the two, and some nodes on the network are going to pick up one first, and also nodes are going to pick the other first. And the parameter gamma is like how many, what is the proportion of the nodes on the network that's going to pick the selfish miner block. And depending on the characteristics of the DAA, you might end up creating a situation where picking the selfish miner's block is always advantageous. And effectively, you created a situation where gamma equal 1, almost always. And so that's not an ideal stuff. And that's a very difficult problem to solve. That's a very difficult problem to solve at the DAA level without screwing up a bunch of other stuff. And this is one of the main constraints that ended up, making the DAA look the way it looks. Because when you mix like exponential decay or this kind of other solution that are proposed now with mechanism to mitigate that problem, you end up with solutions that are completely unstable. But what came up with a recent discussion is that almost 2 years ago now, there is a modification that we did in the ABC software to mitigate selfish mining that is probably as good as what the DAA can do. So we can drop that constraint at the DAA level. And basically it's including hysteresis. So it's not selecting just the best chain, but when two chains are in difficulty, like very close, so one chain has like 0.1% more work than the other chain, we're not gonna flip to the 0.1% more work. We're just gonna keep the first scene block. And so even since we have that rule, actually this, this effect that causes gamma to reach 1 in some situation with selfish mining doesn't exist anymore. So this is a constraint that we can drop on the DAA. Though if we do that, I think we can do that. I think that's fine. Well, we should probably do that actually. But we need to be very mindful that if we do that, then similar measure than what we do in the Bitcoin ABC software need to be implemented in any other kind of software that is going to be used for mining. Because if not, then basically you open yourself to be attacked by a selfish miner, which is probably not something that you want to do. So that's the trade-off here. Yeah.
Thank you, Amaury. I just wanted to read out a comment that came in from Scott Roberts again. I think we all agree on the number 4, which is the current DAA is aggravating other aspects. All are solved immediately and optimally by estimating the current hash rate, HR, and setting the target equals, oh God, I'm going to get lost here, 2 to the 256/600/HR. If we are not going to do anything exotic, the whole discussion then shifts to optimally determining HR, but it gets complicated because the problem is recursive HR. If you guys could read that, maybe somebody else can read the technical jargon because I'm not familiar with the best way to describe it.
Yeah, you're saying the problem is recursive HR affect the target and the target affect HR. And so you may end up with stability problems.
Yeah, basically we've got a feedback loop. The difficulty adjustment algorithm is operating as a controller, kind of like a thermostat, and the difficulty adjustment algorithm determines the profitability, which in turn determines the hash rate, which in turn determines the difficulty. There's like that loop that's going on. And because of that, because you've got this control system, it's important to make sure that like the DAA doesn't overshoot or doesn't have any inherent oscillatory behavior, or it'll exacerbate that feedback loop and generate some stuff.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that. Now, I recognize that we're still in the description of the problem, and I want someone else to give me an indication of when we need to move on with more specifics about what needs to change and what needs to remain the same. So let's make sure that there is agreement about what the problem is and why it's needed to be changed.
Well, I just wanted to throw out on the table that there's a whole bunch of other considerations that aren't, I wouldn't call them part of the problem statement, but just things like how easy, like ease of implementation and impact on, say, wallets. There's a whole bunch of like other requirements, and I think Jonathan and Karol have both like done a good job of listing all those. So I just wanted to, actually one other that came up recently, someone mentioned like the ease of generating zero knowledge proofs for proof of work. So the current DAA is, I guess, kind of hard to do that because it needs a lot of data as input, whereas one of these proposed ones might be easier. So there's a whole bunch of other kind of ancillary goals and requirements, but I think pretty much everyone agrees on most of those.
Yeah, if anybody wants to read my list of requirements for any DAA, it's at the end of my article, and I'm posting the read.cash article that I wrote into the chat. So you can skip down to it. It's 12 points.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. And one more housekeeping item. We've had Jason Dreyzehner join us, and I'd like Jason to introduce himself, if he could, please.
Hey y'all, I'm Jason Dreyzehner. Working on liboff and bitoff stuff. It's a way of using BitcoinCash's virtual machine for authentication and general authentication of messages and login and a few other things.
Thank you, Jason, another well-respected member of the community. So let's go back to the problem. Why is the change needed? Jacob, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, just two quick comments. First, I think we could talk a long time about the specifics of the problem, but in my opinion, or as far as I'm concerned, we've identified the problem enough well already to move on to possible solutions, but you know, I'm open to the group and all that. My second point was just, people may or may not agree with it, but I would attempt to summarize the sort of core problem here. If we had to pick one problem, it's that the difficulty adjustment algorithm tries to make a 10-minute block on average. And to do that, it uses an estimate of the current hash rate. If it has an accurate estimate of the current hash rate, it's not hard to make an expected block time of 10 minutes. That part is not the problem. So I would say the fundamental problem is that the current DAA does not accurately estimate the current hash rate.
Thank you, Jacob. I'm seeing a number of thumbs up on your comment. So I didn't plan on doing any voting in this meeting, so we'll just we'll move on. Anybody else like to comment on what's been said so far about the problem? I do have a comment from Freetrader, which I'll read, which is, I'm interested to hear more about Mangerian's, or whoever proposed it, zero knowledge add-on requirement as it relates to the DAA. If a link could be posted, or
yeah, I don't have a link. I don't have any reference for that, unfortunately. It was just something that someone mentioned privately, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
I
can talk to it though. So one of the idea that has been flied out there to improve scalability is to use zero knowledge proof to prove that the block is correct. And so because we know how to do very succinct proof now, you can use that, you know, even for SPV to track the chain or whatever, like very well, and you can verify everything that way. So that's interesting for scalability. But there are different algorithms that are easier or harder to implement as zero knowledge proofs, and so there are some people who are interested to make sure that the algorithm chosen can be implemented as zero knowledge proof. Though I don't think we should make that our main concern, mostly because like the script system and all of that is going to be way harder anyway. So I don't expect that part of it, and maybe that part of it doesn't even need a zero knowledge proof actually, because you only need the header chain, which is, you know, not that big. It's considered okay to be downloaded by your light client to follow everything else. So I think, you know, this is better if we can make it so that it's easy to do zero knowledge proof, but I don't think that should be our main goal.
Could I just confirm that everyone understands what Amaury just said? Okay. Not hearing any complaints. Who would like to speak next?
Are we moving on to the next topic, or are we still discussing the problem?
We are if we're done with that. So
yeah, I think the next topic's ready to go.
All right, great. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Jonathan, for keeping me on track. So the next one is what needs to change and what needs to remain the same. Jonathan?
So the issue with the current algorithm is oscillations. Karol mentioned this a little bit, but what's going on is that you've got like a, oh wait, actually I should be screen sharing. One second, there we go. You guys see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've got this 144 block window, and when blocks leave that window, it causes the average hash rate during that window to suddenly change. So the act of blocks leaving the window in the bottom left corner causes new blocks in the top right corner to have basically the same hash rate as the blocks leaving the window. So what I think we need to change in order to get rid of this property is to use a difficulty adjustment algorithm that causes the effect of a block to dissipate slowly and consistently over time, rather than dissipating all entirely at the point that it hits the 145th block. So I think that's like a very key thing to getting rid of that oscillation. And that's something that you also see in control systems theory. You want to have all of your positive, this counts as positive feedback. You want to have your positive feedback spread out over time, so it's not all concentrated in one place. If you have concentrated positive feedback at, say, a 145 block delay, that generates an oscillation.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to point out that we've had strong agreement from Jacob and Josh Ellithorpe during the course of Jonathan's presentation just now. Anyone else like to speak to it?
So I have something that I think needs to remain the same, just to make sure it's called out, is that we need to make sure that SPV clients have an easy time implementing any algorithm or change that we propose. And that's something that the current algorithm did. And I think that that needs to remain the same, the ease of implementation across SPV clients.
I'd also be curious just to like expand on that is like if someone's looked at all the different wallets out there, and I'm thinking especially of wallets that aren't totally focused on BCH and whether they even use SPV proofs or not. Like I'm thinking of like Edge Wallet and stuff like that. Like
so Imaginary Username has been compiling a list of all the different wallets. Anyone that's talking to Electrum X or using that infrastructure doesn't mind it because it's basically RPC. Neutrino's affected. Any standard SPV wallets are affected. LibBitcoin Bitcoin J is a BitcoinCash J is affected, and he's been putting together a complete list of those that would require changes. He's not in the meeting today, but I know that that has been compiled.
If it's possible to get a link to that, Josh, that would be appreciated if you could pop it into the Zoom notes here.
I'm not sure I have a link to it. Freetrader might have a link to it. I know that they were putting it together in the Slack. I'm not sure if a document's been compiled.
Okay, well, if we can get that before the meeting is compiled and made public beyond this, that would be great. Any further comments on what needs to change and what needs to remain the same?
I'd just point out I mean, Josh is mostly right that the SPV, the current algorithm can be implemented, but there's some trickiness to implementing it because if you want to, let's say, start your SPV wallet at a certain height going forward, you can't do that because you need to know that 144 block window. So you have this like weird aspect where you need like to download 144 blocks before you can even validate anything to start going forward. I mean, it's doable, but it's in like an awkward aspect of the SPV currently.
Yeah, the current proposal from Jonathan would actually remove that requirement, which is quite nice.
Freetrader typed in a comment.
Okay.
He said, I guess this is something that should stay the same as the block header format and the interpretation of the fields. So
let me just reread that from Freetrader. It says block header format / interpretation of fields to remain the same. So everybody's clear. Karol, thank you.
Yes, I think many miners and also developers argue that what should remain the same is the allowance for the out of order timestamps, because the claim is that it would break mining to change it. I know there are different opinions about it. Like Jonathan Toomim is of the opinion that it is okay to change it, but maybe it's no longer required for the current proposal to change that. Yeah.
Okay, and because Jonathan's in the room, just get a confirmation that that's what he believes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely makes people uncomfortable to propose making timestamps be monotonic. I think that discomfort is ultimately without merit. I think that it's that it can be completely fine. It just requires us to rethink how things work and also to patch a few bugs. Not major bugs, but it does require a few changes. But yes, like the proposal the main proposal that I'm putting forward does make it unnecessary to make timestamps monotonic. However, the main alternate proposal doesn't actually require that, but it benefits significantly if that is on the table.
So just because we are in the subject of what needs to change and what needs to remain the same, are there additional comments about those items that need to be brought forward?
Okay, so maybe I will add one that, I mean, it's not a part of the current proposal, but I think it's important that the proposal, if this one is not accepted, then the proposal needs to be like, we agreed on the term predetermined values towards the predetermined values that go into the algorithm, that all the values that go there need to be signed by some, like fast proof of work. They have to be supported by proof of work, basically.
Thanks, Karol. Go ahead,
What
John.
Karol's trying to say is that real-time targeting algorithms should not be on the table. That is, you should not be constructing a block in which the difficulty for mining that block is based on the timestamp that that block eventually gets mined with.
Yeah.
And I am not 100% sure that that's a requirement. I kind of dislike RTTs, but I don't think that it's quite necessary to completely rule them out. It's just not necessarily a good idea to consider them, because I think that the cost-benefit ratio is low.
Pardon my ignorance on this, but there's been a comment to FTL, and I'm not sure what that stands for, so maybe Jonathan.
Faster than light.
FTL is what Zowie calls the max future block time limit.
Okay.
It's the future timestamp limit is what the initials stand for. So the FTL limit currently says that a block that has a timestamp that is 2 hours ahead of local time or network time is invalid. And that allows for a miner, such as a selfish miner, to intentionally mine a block with a future timestamp in order to lower the difficulty for the subsequent block.
And the question is, should we lower it?
Maybe.
Maybe. How definitive?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can talk to that, yeah, and well, ideally you would want it to be much smaller than it is. Right now it's 2 hours. The problem is that it depends on your clock, and not everybody has the same clock. And so not everybody received the block at the same time. And so not everybody is going to agree on the result of that check. And so you want the margin to be absurd. Like, you know that the block is not going to take 2 hours to propagate on the network, or if it does, then we have much bigger problem than the future timestamp limit anyway. But you want to take like a limit that is, like not even in the same realm as real value that you expect in practice, so that you never run into the situation where people are not going to quite agree on the result of that check based on subjective informations. And so reducing it is effectively a risk trade-off. The more we reduce it, and the more likely it is that we end up with an involuntary split in the network. And so right now that value is like absurdly big, so that the risk is effectively zero. And then, it's a choice, like, do we want to make things a bit more risky and lower that value, or do you want to stay there? I'd like to point out that those kind of subjective solution can be reconciliated with other consensus algorithm, such as like avalanches, obviously something that come to mind. But generally, like, when you make a subjective decision, either the decision needs to be so obvious that everybody, even though technically it's subjective, everybody's going to make the same decision, or you need a way to reconcile the results. And if we have a way to reconcile the result, we can probably lower that value to maybe something less than a minute. No problem.
Thank you, Amaury. We have two comments that have been typed in. I'm just going to read them out and let you guys continue. The first one is from three comments. The first one is from Freetrader. He says, I'm in favor of lowering max future block time significantly, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. It should be possible for miners to even set their clock time by wristwatch with such accuracy. The second comment was from Jacob. It said, I understand why inaccurate clocks require high FTL. I'm not so clear why slowed block propagation requires it. But anyway, FTI is a minor topic. And then from Scott Roberts, I don't think there is any risk, even if FTL equals 60 seconds, some coins do it. So, anybody want to
yeah, the block propagation is obviously an important parameter because not everybody is going to receive the block at the same time. And so the wall clock is going to be different for everybody based on those differences, right? So if a blocks propagate very slowly, the discrepancy between the clocks of the people that receive the block is going to be higher. And so the discrepancy in result of the check for the FTL is going to be more different. And so, like, for instance, people are proposing right now, I think it was Freetrader, to say 5 or 10 minutes. Like right now, it's possible to create a block that takes more than 5 minutes to propagate on the network. It's not even that hard. And so if you do that, then nobody is going to agree on that freaking check. And so, so 5 minutes is probably something we should not do.
I have a hand up by Jonathan.
Yeah, so this is half a joke, but also half not. Somebody recently, I think it was imaginary username, but somebody in BCHN's Slack proposed renaming the FTL limit to the tachyon limit. And it seems funny because like fast and light tachyons, but actually it's not that. The reason why we should be calling it the tachyon limit is because the tachyon limit is for blocks that are propagating negatively in time. So if you have a block that takes 5 minutes to propagate, that doesn't hit the tachyon limit. It's only if a block takes negative 5 minutes to propagate that you hit the tachyon limit.
I love the science fiction references. It's great. So moving on. The next comment from Freetrader said 5 minutes equals Zowi's proposal. 10 minutes was Jonathan Toomim's proposal from GitHub. And then Scott says, okay, yes, if block propagation is 5 minutes sometimes, then FTL needs to be greater than 10 minutes due to attacks. And then
I can also mention on the interplanetary thing, again, and because it's the tachyon limit, if you have somebody on the moon sending you a block, it's going to arrive on Earth with a timestamp that is in the past, not the future. So you don't run into the max block, the future timestamp limit in that scenario.
Okay.
I find it hard. Go ahead.
My idea about it would be it might be a correction if you know that your block is super big and you know it will propagate for 5 minutes. You put a timestamp like a bit to the future because you know when people will receive it. So maybe this way it can be hit in this forward time limit.
Karol, I'm sorry, we had two people shaking their heads on this in a negative way. So.
In a negative
There's
way,
no incentive to do that. There's no incentive. There's no game theoretic incentive. There's no reward for adding an accurate timestamp to your block. There's only a punishment if you add a timestamp that potentially interferes with the FTL limit. So, and like also the software, the pool software that sets the timestamps.
Does not do that. Yeah, it does not do that. Yeah, that was like a mental experiment.
Okay.
So yeah, people can definitively do that. They can, but there is nothing that forces them to do it. And they may actually choose not to do it if they want to mess with the network in some way.
Right, the FTL is a concern, especially with the way it's currently implemented, in that it could be a way for attackers to intentionally cause a chain split. But that's equally true whatever the FTL is, even if it's 2 hours in the future. If somebody wants to cause a chain split with that, they can. The only way to solve that is to change how the FTL is enforced rather than changing what the FTL actually is.
Yeah, like using some kind of like Amaury mentioned, using avalanche or some similar thing. Yeah.
Yeah, or hysteresis, or a soft punishment where a block that violates FTL gets ignored for 24 hours or 1 hour or something like that, instead of being ignored permanently.
So it's actually the case, like if you look at the code, when you violate FTL, the block is not marked invalid, and it's not, and the peer is not being disconnected for sending invalid stuff, like happens when you violate consensus rules.
Sorry, I thought that the block is marked as invalid, but the peer is not disconnected. I think that needs to be double checked.
That would be very strange.
It is strange, but that's what the code
let me double check
says
that.
Yeah.
Okay, while you guys are taking a minute to check that out, I just want to point out, Scott says, if what Jonathan is saying is true, then FTL can be 60 seconds. So just want to make sure that's seen and heard.
Yeah, as long as people are using NTP, then it can be, and also as long as there aren't any miners out there still using the timestamp rolling technique that was common with the Gitwork protocol. But like the change to Stratum should have long since eliminated those. That's like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old mining protocol.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jacob.
Yeah, I have lots of opinions about the FTL, but I'm curious if people actually think, like, how big a component is it of the topic today? Like, to me, it's mostly a secondary topic.
Yeah, I agree.
Jonathan says, I think everyone here thinks it's not important today. I think we should move on. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
I was about to suggest that too.
Yeah, okay, great. So are we still on topic number 2? What needs to change and what needs to remain the same? Yes.
So this might be obvious, but we want to make sure that we can preserve the difficulty drops that happen on testnet, to make sure, because hash rate sometimes just is not available on testnet. So I want to make sure that it's just stated that the 20-minute difficulty drop on testnet is still, or some equivalent feature is still available, so that testnet doesn't get impacted.
Okay. I think that is now.
On that note, I
ahead.
find it amusing to mention that the testnet rule is an RTT. It is a violation of the predetermination rule that Karol was proposing.
David, I'm not sure if you were able to see my hand raised earlier. I also made a comment and that went by. So I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was on the topic of the RTT. I just had a quick question. So are we discussing things that should be ruled out for the upcoming hard fork, or is this sort of for BCH in the foreseeable future? Just curious about that.
I mean, I wouldn't rule it out. I think we should.
Not RTT specifically, just ideas on the table. That's what I'm asking about.
What's the feeling of the group?
I would like to hear George discuss his ideas. I know Amaury has been interested in them. Just I would like to just open the floor, give George a chance to discuss those things for a minute.
Absolutely.
Even though I don't think we want anything exotic right now. It may be something for the future. And since he's here, it's a good time to let him speak.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. And I think that that's a great idea. Let's get George to make his comments, and then I'll read.
Yeah. So it may have seemed that I want to sort of like talk about my ideas, but actually I don't really care so much about that. And I do see some comments that say that the November hard fork is the urgent thing to discuss. I just wanted to make sure that, I don't know, that we don't prematurely close down discussion or ideas for more future looking DAAs. So I don't feel any particular need to discuss it now. I just kind of wanted to keep the group's mind open.
If you could talk a bit about bonded mining, I think that would be very interesting, because one of our problem statement is making sure that the miners that are, committed to the chain do well versus miners that are more opportunistic. And the DAA can improve the situation, but ultimately, like whatever DAA you choose, the switch miner are always going to have an edge. Though the bonded mining proposal seems like a more sustainable solution, or like an actual solution to that problem, not just making the problem not as bad.
Sure, I'd be happy to kind of introduce the idea to those of you that aren't familiar with it. I've had some discussions with Jonathan online, sort of in more detail. I'd say at a high level, it's an idea and it's not, ready for prime time. So I certainly wouldn't advocate for using it in November. But the concept is really pretty simple: to ask miners what their future hash rate is going to be, have them commit to that and collateralize it with some bond. And of course, you're always going to have some sort of inference problem to solve. So currently, we look at past block times and use those statistics to try to figure out what the current hash rate is. Bonded mining turns that on its head. When you ask miners what their current hash rate is going to be, then it becomes very trivial to know what the future hash rate will be, but then you have to have some mechanism for making sure that they're honest. And so the key inference problem with bonded mining is to just measure the block times for each miner and to perform some statistical analysis to confirm that they were being honest in what they committed to. And so the end result there is that you have, even if miners are free to change their hash rate, every block they mine, they can update their commitment, but you at least have a very good concept of what the current hash rate is in principle.
Questions, comments for George?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's a very interesting idea, and I know many people like it. Also in the mining community, and also I have a comment on the RTT. I believe it is fundamentally not viable to do so, because whenever you have the predetermined difficulty, you know what is going to happen. Like the information of what is going to happen next is set. It is known how many hashes on average will be needed to solve this block, and this is not the case if the difficulty was not set beforehand. I believe that the information is not there. It doesn't exist there. Yeah. So that's my opinion on the like why the predeterminism is a necessary condition for a DAA, like from a fundamental standpoint. Maybe there are other opinions about it. Maybe
I'm not sure I totally follow that argument, but not to say that it's not valid. But if you have anything like written up or something you can point me to on that argument, I'd be interested to look into it.
Yeah, I actually have written like a small paragraph about it in my like a sketch proposal for the algorithm that was actually wrong, but yeah, I can point you to that later. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
David, you're muted, but your face is going. I just want to say that I don't think anybody is actively advocating for RTTs for BitcoinCash,
Yeah.
especially not for November. I don't think that it's a good time to spend too much time arguing for or against them, given that nobody's actually arguing for them. I think we should just kind of skip over RTTs.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that. Just before, Jacob, I give you the floor, I just want to point out a couple of comments from Freetrader. In my opinion, the DAA is urgent, and we are looking for a resolution for November. Other sophisticated ideas should not be ruled out, but are unlikely to be matured before then. In particular, even for November, we have a planned August feature freeze. Just a reminder about the feature freeze, which is August the 15th. Sorry, Jacob, go ahead, please.
Sure, just a very brief comment. Just getting back to the big picture here about what we want to change and what we don't want to change. If I had to summarize, like, very briefly, the one thing that we want to change, I'm repeating myself a bit from earlier, but I think the one thing to change is to increase the accuracy of the current hash rate estimate. If the current hash rate estimate was good, then the blocks would be about 10 minutes and smoothly distributed. If the current hash rate is way off, if the current hash rate estimate is considerably off of the real current hash rate, then you're going to get block times that are off, that are too short or too long. So the current hash rate estimate is kind of fundamental.
I'm kind of curious to know, is there agreement with Jacob on that?
I agree.
Yes.
Disagreement? Not hearing any.
I mean, I guess I kind of agree, but I also, like, I'm not 100% sold that that's like the fundamental problem. But
yeah, same here. I think it's one way of describing the issue that's close to, but not exactly on the mark.
How would you improve this description?
I probably wouldn't. I'd probably just move on.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that's where we're at, is that, you know, we're here to try and find solutions.
That's kind of where I'm at too. But
I do want to back up a little bit. Sorry, Anthony. I do want to back up a little bit and say something else about bonded mining. So there's an ongoing discussion between me and George about this. I'm currently of the opinion that bonded mining would not actually be able to fix the oscillation issue. I don't think that it has enough information on the hour time scale to be able to address it. I think that the checks that we have for ensuring honesty are mostly based on ensuring that the distribution of block intervals is exponential. And that is something that a miner, especially a miner with a large amount of idle hash rate, could quite easily manipulate. But
the counterpoint to that is that I don't quite agree with Jonathan yet. I guess I agree that it is not yet known.
Yeah.
So I believe it would be harder to manipulate than I think you believe. And also, like, even assert, I think I was reading your document on that, and there is some ability to cause some oscillations or to abuse it to some small extent, right? So I think any protocol is going to have some potential for abuse, and it's really just a matter of like figuring out what that exact potential is. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
I haven't seen any way of making it oscillatory. I have tried to generate oscillations, and it does damp the oscillations pretty well. There are, of course, abuses. You know, there's the future time limit issue where if you jump a timestamp forward by 2 hours, that will reduce the difficulty by 2.8%. But that's also true for any other algorithm.
Maybe I was misunderstanding your table then, because there was a column that I believe had a heading to the effect of like greedy, something like that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
The closer you get to 0, the more neutral you are. And so, every protocol had some, let's say, advantage for a switch miner or something like that. So perhaps they're not like directly causing oscillations. I don't think really there's a question that bonded mining is going to necessarily cause oscillations, but that it could be exploited. So, there's always going to be some susceptibility.
Yeah, I can actually show some data on that. If I go to the stable price scenario, then once this updates, this advantage goes down. A lot of this advantage that's present for somebody who's switch mining versus steady mining is actually just because the price is always changing. And the switch miners are taking advantage of the price fluctuations in part. There's also the statistical fluctuation from the block interval itself being a sample from the exponential distribution. But yeah, so like that's not necessarily things being gained. That's just like the difficulty is an imperfect estimate of hash rate.
Yeah, and so, okay, thank you for qualifying that for me. And I guess what I would say is just that, like bonded mining won't have quite as bad of a susceptibility to switch miners sort of suddenly changing their mind because, of course, they're bonded. And so, I might argue that bonded mining has less susceptibility to this switch miner effect. Perhaps it has some susceptibility to oscillations in the realm that assert doesn't. And so I would just say that, to leave it, like, I'd like to leave it open to say that we don't know exactly what bonded mining's, how it would perform in similar circumstances.
Let me just add Scott's comments here. He's typed them in. There will not be enough oscillations to worry about if assert or EMA are used. So I agree with Jonathan that if the only thing bonded mining does is reduce oscillations.
Yeah, I guess I would say that's not the only thing that it does.
Yeah.
It's my argument.
We have agreement to disagree. That's fine.
And last comment on this issue. It's possible that bonded mining might reduce the incentive to do switch mining, but it also might inadvertently exacerbate it. Like the switch miners are doing a useful service. They are changing the hash rate whenever the price changes in order to keep things in equilibrium. And if changing your hash rate is hard or delayed via bonded mining, that means that things are going to depart from equilibrium farther. So that's just going to be.
Okay. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, you can continue. Sorry.
No, that's my point.
I just jumping on a little. So I would say it's not actually going to stop switch miners from switch mining. It's just going to force them to be honest about when they do it. So they're, between blocks, yes, they have to honor their commitment. But in between blocks, they're free to change. They just have to tell us about it, and that is going to mitigate the effects of the switch mining, which is really the problem we're having with estimating the hash rate when these switch miners are moving around. Is just that it's hard to really pin down where they're at any given time. So I believe bonded mining can help with that. If you can get them to be honest, they can fluctuate as much as they want as long as we're aware of when they're doing it.
Question for you, George. If we do bonded mining, do you believe that it will still be necessary to change the DAA in order to take advantage of that new hash rate information?
Well, I mean, you really don't need a DAA per se with bonded mining. You literally just aggregate the commitments, and that's the current hash rate. You work the target out from that. Does that make sense? So there's no DAA proper. There's no feedback controller or anything like that.
So there's no filter. You're just completely replacing the DAA with a different DAA that is based on this bonded promise. Yeah,
there's no need. Once you're certain that you have you're certain you know the hash rate that everyone's going to be operating with, there's no need for an estimator of hash rate. You just directly set the target. The only estimator that's necessary is in inferring deviations from that commitment, making sure that miners are honest.
Yeah, so I think I understand now that this is a kind of hash rate estimation mechanism that is based on the incentives instead of like averaging and learning, right? So basically, fundamentally, we are doing the same thing. We are doing the same thing, that we are estimating the hash rate, but by asking.
I would say it's fundamentally different in that, so feedback controllers are using historical data to guess about future hash rate. And so they're sort of reactive. And bonded mining is proactive because it's asking about future hash rate. So it's capable in theory of doing something that feedback controllers never will be able to, which is to sort of predict the future.
Yeah, with incentives instead of statistics.
Absolutely, to have incentives. Yeah.
And I guess the miners can see each other's commitment. So then it's sort of like a market, like they can say, okay, there's this much hash rate going to be mining. So therefore I'll decide based on that whether I want to add my own or not.
Yeah, absolutely. They probably will be thinking about profitability based on the current commitment.
That was kind of like going back to Jacob's thing. Like that was kind of my attempt at a problem statement, was saying like, we're trying to like set the profitability for miners, but there's like many variables, including stuff it's impossible for us to figure out for that. But this way it kind of gets at that.
So Freetrader's brought forward edge case, how to cope with bonded miners exiting. If you do not have that committed hash rate data, how are you going to perform a target computation?
There's like a deleveraging process. So there's a bootstrap here. So basically the devil's in the details. Of course, there are some things that have to be worked out. And so there's a bootstrap period. The miners can only devote a certain amount of hash rate initially as they open a window of like n blocks that they've bootstrapped for. And then after that, we always have an n block window to of bond and to assess their hash rate. And when they want to unbond and deleverage, they do so one block at a time, reduce their hash rate, and then they can exit after a certain period of time. So it's, I guess the short answer is they can't just leave in one block. They have to deleverage.
Okay, short answers are good. We are looking at item number 2, what needs to change and what needs to remain the same. I think we're delving into possible solutions at this point. I want to make sure that this is all on the table. All the possible solutions are being brought forward and being discussed. Does anyone else have anything they want to bring forward at this point?
Do you mean as a potential solution?
Yes.
As a specific solution?
Possible solution.
Yeah, I think that a difficulty adjustment algorithm like ASSERT or like WTEMA would solve the problem.
Okay. Any comments on that statement?
I didn't hear what he said. You said you think it's the only way to solve the problem?
I said a way. They're definitely not the only ways. LWMA would also solve it. WT would also solve it. There's a bunch of difficulty adjustment algorithms that have the property of spreading out the positive feedback over time. And ASSERT and WTEMA are just 2 examples of that class, and they happen to be pretty good ones.
So there's a number of multiple choice options at this point. Any other possible solutions to be put on the table?
Well, I thought Amaury had one. I don't know if he's not wanting to bring it up, or a potential idea to basically soft fork in, like use some kind of reconciliation mechanism to say, okay, when there's turbo blocks, we're gonna not accept them basically, and then not actually change the DAA for what the target is in the blocks, but you could essentially, it would be like a soft fork to, and I don't know if that's like a good idea or not, but it was.
Yeah, it's a bit,
it's sort of speculative.
Yeah, it's a bit speculative, so I don't know if we need to spend too much time on that. But basically, the idea was you use your wall clock to soft fork a higher difficulty effectively when there are turbo blocks. But that means that you need to reconcile those clocks somehow. So you need some other consensus algorithm. And you can set it up in such a way that it's basically lower than what the DAA gives you, like almost always. So almost always you get the same.
While your audio is becoming recovered, I'm just going to read out from Freetrader. I would agree that assert or WTEMA would likely adequately solve the points listed earlier that are basically evident issues with the current DAA. So, sorry, Amaury, check your microphone.
Okay, so I was saying basically you can have some kind of RTT effectively based on the wall clock that you soft fork in that's going to give you a result that is lower than what the DAA gives you almost always, except when there are turbo blocks. And that gives you a way to disincentivize turbo blocks. But you need a way to reconcile the decision made based on the wall clock. So you need like avalanche or something like that.
Thank you, Amaury. Anybody want to comment on Amaury before I bring forward something else? Nope. Scott has asked, is anyone against WTEMA or assert in the next fork? And by the next fork, I think you're talking about November, correct? Is anyone against?
I guess my whole comment, I guess I have a question and a comment. I don't think it fits in the agenda, which is basically like, in order for that to happen, like people have to make it happen. So we can all be for it. And then, so I guess I have a question like for Jonathan and Amaury too. Like, I've seen a lot of discussion and like public posts about the proposal and so on, but to actually go through trying to get it merged into ABC, like, is there efforts being made to do that and to go through like all the review and Amaury's questions and all that? And I guess same question for Amaury, like, is there like a path that is laid out or whatever that is like making that possible?
I guess I'll take that first. I'm definitely down to answer and address any questions that any node team has. That definitely includes Amaury. It also includes Freetrader, who has been taking advantage of that already quite a bit. I was actually up until like 3:30 a.m. last night interacting with Freetrader and I don't know how to pronounce his name, MTRZ, whatever,
right.
From BCHN.
Just call him Corgi.
Yeah, sure, Corgi boy. About like, they're going through a code review for the sample assert implementation that I did and rewriting it and stuff like that. I'd also be enthusiastic about interacting with BU and helping them get proposals done. It's worth mentioning that the BCHN and ABC code bases are very similar. So if needed, and if like the quality of the BCHN implementation gets high, it may be possible for Amaury to do a review of that and hopefully have far fewer comments than he would do if he were trying to implement it from scratch.
Amaury, can you speak to that?
Yeah. So, well, first, before answering the question, I think the question is actually pretty bad because so there is what Antony pointed out, like we can all be for it, and still, if nobody does the work, it doesn't happen. So that's one of the problem with that question. But the second problem is also that it's completely the wrong frame, right? Like it's like who's against it? It's like you get to go around ecosystem participants and convince them to do something, right? Like the default, I mean, I mean, yeah, like you can have like everybody yelling at some, you can have everybody yelling on Twitter about something. It's not gonna make it happen. It's not like, it's not how you reach consensus through an ecosystem. You go see the important actors and strike a deal with them effectively, even though that's more of a technical deal than a business deal. But if you require something from some third party, then you go see them, you see what their problems are, you address them, and you find a way forward. And popularity contest is not going to help with that. So to get back on changing the DA itself, I'm okay with changing the DA in November. Obviously, the devil is in the details, and there are a lot of details, especially with something like Hazard, where you need to do exponential, but you need to do it without using floating points. And, so there are, like actually kind of like Hazard in the abstract, like as it is described in the paper, but it's using mathematical functions that don't exist in a computer in a deterministic manner, right? So implementing that in a way that is satisfactory is a bit of a challenge. And so the devil is in the detail, and yeah, pretty much.
I mean, I guess I just have the impression, like from an ABC perspective, ideally you'd want code basically being like put in now, essentially, for something that's going to be in the code freeze in August. So I'm just a bit worried that like there's all this work that's been going on, and then it kind of like, I don't want to end up in a situation where like some of the implementations are like, okay, we're implementing this, and then we have like a bunch of code dropped at the last minute into ABC, and then Amaury is kind of in a difficult position, being like, well, I don't feel comfortable accepting it, but you don't want to,
Yeah, that has been a bit of a recurring problem where people dump consensus change. Like, actually, like right now, it's a month before the freeze date, and it's actually better than average. Many people do it like a week or two before the freeze date or so. And that puts us in a very tough spot, and it's bound to make people unhappy because we cannot possibly review everything and get like all the iteration necessary to get something good in 2 weeks. In a month, it's a bit short, I'd say. And probably like the DAA is important enough and there's traction enough so that it's worth doing it, but it probably wouldn't be worth it for something smaller, even if this is something that we want. Because effectively what's happening right now is that we have to throw out the window like any kind of timeline or schedule or whatever that we want to have for the software. And the problem with that is that as it keeps happening, there is no capability that exists to work on stuff that are longer term. And so it's effectively a condemnation of BCH on the long term if we continue to operate that way. Because it's like fire after fire after fire, and the work that needs to happen on long time scale, that it's more than a month or two, just cannot happen in that environment. But it's a bit outside of the DA stuff, but it's a bit of a bad pattern that we've adopted as a community.
So, but just to be clear, we're not 1 week away from the freeze date; we're a month. And
yeah,
I think Jacob, you had a comment here as well.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's well. Let me just try to be succinct. I mean, Amaury, I understand what you're saying about it shouldn't be a popularity contest, and it shouldn't just be like these sort of Twitter mobs coming and demanding massive changes to this infrastructure on short notice. I think that's intuitive to a lot of people, but like from an outsider's perspective, like the current oscillation problem is actually quite bad. Like if it can be fixed reasonably safely, I would think that's in everyone's interest. I mean, for one thing, that'll spare you from being distracted by these debates about the oscillations. So, I if the question was, do we do this DA change or we do some other clear solution which can also be implemented by November, and then there's like a competition between trying to understand which solution is better. I understand that, but it sort of seems like the main alternative to a DAA change in November right now is more or less the status quo. And that I just like, given the oscillations, isn't that kind of a bad alternative?
Yeah. So you are correct, but you're also looking at the DAA in a silo, because this shit is happening for everything at the same time randomly, you know? So, and for every single one of those, it's actually reasonable, but what's happening all the time is just completely unreasonable. If you go back, if you go back a month or two, everybody was yelling about the transaction chain limit. And that was the stuff that is on fire, and you know, it needed to be addressed. And you go back like one more month, and this is some other crap. And it's just a pretty bad pattern. And you know, like honestly, all of those problems are worth working on. They all improve the user experience in some way. But if we create a fire drill for every single one of them randomly, then nobody is able to have any kind of long-term planning. And that also means that, you know, like this issue, we've been having it for a long ass time, right? And the reason it's not fixed by now already has also have a lot to do with that, right? Because when you are pulled into all kind of different direction, randomly by the mob, then what's happening is that you don't have the time to dedicate to like weight all the options, especially for a problem that is as complex as the DAA. And well, Jonathan pre-hashed a bunch of it, so it's probably doable now. But I think this is probably something that should have been addressed earlier, but because there is always a fire, then it's not possible. It doesn't happen.
So, Amaury, just to be clear, what I hear you saying is that there is a window of opportunity here to find some possibility of implementing for November because we're not doing everything within 1 week of the freeze date.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it comes at the cost of throwing any kind of you know, schedule or you know, timeline out of the window, right? And I would say again, right? And it's happening all the time. And so,
sure.
So this have a disastrous effect on the project longer term.
Sure, but I just want to point out this is the first time that we've managed to gather all the players around a specific issue into an important meeting, and I believe that there's good conversation going on, and I think you'll agree with me there as well.
Yep.
So, am I the only one that's a little bit optimistic here, or anybody want to share that with me?
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic. I just want to, like, my main concern is that, like, I'm working on ABC, right? So, like, for ABC, like, I want to see it go. Like, I don't see a lot of like ABC specific, like, trying to get the code in and review, like looking through all the little details. Like I see that happening in other places, and I'm just like, I think it'll be frustrating for everyone if, like, you know, you put in this thing, it's gone through all this review already, and then it starts getting nitpicked again by the ABC developers, and you're like, well, we've already reviewed it somewhere else or whatever. But then from their perspective, they still want to do the review on it, and so on. So I would just encourage that to basically happen.
Sure, and I
maximize the chance of it getting in there.
Thank you, Antony. I've been neglected. Freetrader has a couple of comments here, and I want to put them out. I agree with the devil in the details and encourage any developers to look at Jonathan's C++ code. It is still a work in progress as far as I know, smiley face. And then he says, we expect to have testable, i.e. test deployable, assert implementation within a few days. So I think that allows a fair bit of time to review carefully. I am optimistic, and thank you, Freetrader. Appreciate that. Anybody want to comment on Freetrader's comments?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it's also on Manjarian's comments as well. I think that one way to move forward is to really talk about the best way based on the conditions that we have right now, which is I do think that the ABC team should have time to nitpick and do the stuff in code review. Code review is really important. We want to make sure that all the teams are very happy with whatever code gets put in. So what I'm wondering is there a way that we could get a champion that takes the code that is currently being developed by Jonathan and gets it into a PR state for ABC, so that we can start getting ABC comments and any concerns they have about the current code, and limit the number of touch points that Jonathan has to basically a single person that helps resolve ABC specific issues with his implementation, while he's working with BCHN as well, so that he can make sure that something quality lands in both places, and we can show, you know, a good level of collaboration with the large amount of work that's already been done. I'm less concerned about smaller implementations like BCHD, because whatever gets worked out by ABC and BCHN, we're going to be porting that logic, and hopefully there are good test cases for us to follow, which makes it a little easier for the smaller node teams to get where they need to go. And I think that's a way to just push forward so that everyone gets the code review that is necessary, and also doesn't put as much of a blocker on forward progress on any existing work that is being done by those teams. Instead of having like everyone in ABC jump in and only look at DAA, if we can have a champion, I think that'd make it a lot easier.
So there's a bit of comment from the audience that I just want to point it out, and that's somebody named Rick James says, Josh has a good idea. I'm just curious to know, feel in the room, you know, how do you guys feel about what's going on? You going to get a thumbs up or a hands?
I'm planning on submitting a diff to ABC within a few days.
Excellent.
So yeah,
I'm
going to be my own champion.
Sure, and you can do that. Anthony's given a thumbs up. Amaury, are you in on this as well?
Yeah, well, let's see how that happens.
Okay, so cautiously optimistic. That's good. Any other? Go ahead, Jonathan.
One note: there's still substantial bike shedding happening about how exactly to implement assert. So the diff that I submit won't necessarily be the final version. It'll just be a reasonable version of assert, and the purpose will be mostly to help get ABC familiar with the code and with the algorithm, so that they can start thinking about how it should be integrated. And yeah, if there are substantial decisions about activation, about the choice of a reference block, median time pass versus block height activation, et cetera, like those changes will still need to be made to the code.
So will the bike shed be orange or green?
Yes.
Okay.
It'll be purple.
Thank you. All right. Any other comments on what's gone on with this movement forward? Scott Roberts says, Jonathan, can you discuss my modified WTEMA as an alternative as a way to reduce the complexity?
I think you're talking about the assert-ish version that uses the median time pass of 7 blocks as a reference block. And no, I can't. I have not looked at that in detail. Sorry. I am a terrible human being.
And the further comment was, and the one that avoids the negative solve time problem, but I think you just addressed that. So, anything further on this part?
I just wanted to say that thumbs up for the optimism, and I'm optimistic too.
Damn, it's spreading. I'm worried about this. Also, there's a comment from Jacob says, Jonathan, you should have stayed up later last night. So,
I mean, the problem is just that I went to sleep. Like, I shouldn't have done that. Like,
okay.
I was already up until 3 a.m. Might as well have just stayed up until 8 for the meeting.
So I sit close to Vancouver here, and I watch people up all night, every night. So it's kind of crazy, and appreciate all the work that's going into this. We are in the possible solutions area. Are you guys comfortable that there is a possible variety of solutions, including the stuff that's come from George?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely some solutions on the table. I think that the one that seems to be most realistic right now for a November timeframe is the proposal from Jonathan. But I think that the devil is in the details. It's really about us making sure that we can come up with a solution that satisfies all the node teams quality-wise and quality test cases and specifications to make sure that other full nodes and, more importantly, SPV wallets and SPV libraries like BitcoinCash J have a very clear specification on how to implement the new algorithm.
Great, Josh. And Scott has just added, I want people to keep my WTEMA in mind in case people don't like the number of lines of code in a cert.
Yeah. I'm familiar with WTEMA, and I guess maybe I can ask Jonathan to comment. Like, as far as I can understand, the only negative thing, or not the only negative thing, but like the way it was implemented before in the simulation was that you just basically bounded the maximum possible change to like 12.5% or something like that. Because if you had a very negative timestamp, you could basically drive the target down to, you know, a very low value that would be impossible to find a block. But I don't know like what the problem is with that, other than I guess you could hit the limits in one direction and like push the emission schedule off schedule.
The main issue with WTEMA is not lowering the difficulty so much as it is underflowing the difficulty.
Yeah.
Underflowing the target.
Yeah, so the target, like lowering the target is what I was saying.
Right. But like, it's not that you would go down to a target that's very difficult to mine a block at. It's that you would go down below 0. Mm-hmm. And since the target is an unsigned integer, if it goes down below 0, that means that it goes up until basically difficulty is 1 again. And that can happen if the timestamp is, or if the solve time, the timestamp delta is negative and large. For a time constant of 416 blocks, that would mean basically negative 416 blocks worth of timestamp shift. And it's difficult to generate those kinds of single block timestamp diffs, but not impossible. And the fact that it's not impossible means that if we do something with WTEMA, we need to figure out some other way of making it impossible to generate those things.
Well, you can just put a bound in the code, you can just bound it, say if it's below whatever, then just bound it there.
If you just bound it at the DAA, then that causes symmetricality issues, and that allows for infinite block attacks in other mechanisms.
Yeah.
So you have to bound it as a consensus rule. You have to prohibit those kinds of timestamps, or you have to use a DAA that does not have that negative solve time singularity, as we call it.
So Scott has commented, we discussed the clips and there's always seems to be an attack on the clips. If the clip would need to be consensus rule instead of inside the DAA.
The clip would need to be a consensus rule instead of inside the DAA.
Are you basically, like, just to clarify, like, so the DAA we have right now has that, like it has bounds in the DAA. So that's currently possible, I guess.
Right, but the current DAA is also different in that it's based on work, not on timestamps.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if you clip a single step, it will automatically go into the next step.
Oh yeah.
So I had Jacob's hand up first, and then Karol.
Yeah, this is a bit of a side comment, but if I was trying to sell ACER, I think the point I would make that's sort of easy to remember is that if you had block timestamps that were like totally normal and orderly, like 600, 1200, 1800, if they're just moving forward like that, if you suddenly have something like 600, 1200, 1800, 1 million, and then you go back to 2400, 3000, if you just have one which is completely way off and then it returns to normalcy, the assert DAA is like the only DAA that doesn't care about that one-off blip. A lot of the other DAAs have the problem that they make a huge adjustment in one direction when you move forward, and then they make a huge, but not quite exactly the same, or sometimes not even close to the same adjustment in the opposite direction when you go back. So the DAA has this one nice, the assert DAA has that one nice property. And I don't know how, Jonathan, others would know more about how useful that is in practice, but theoretically that is one of the big pluses for it.
So let's just quickly jump over to Karol. Don't want to miss his question or comment.
Yeah, so there is a way to do a quadratic approximation of WTMA to eliminate this this problem, like the singularity. It is just a negative, like sufficiently negative solve time is still just a raise in the. Sorry, I have rain here, so probably you hear me worse. But so the sufficiently negative timestamp is still like treated as a small timestamp because there is no singularity. It's just a quadratic behavior around this this range.
And yeah, that quadratic formula has not yet been simulated extensively.
Yeah, yeah, I have it simulated. Also, sorry, I didn't share the code, but I have it simulated. It's basically like only like 1/2 different from quadratic assert approximation. I mean, it's not relevant, but yeah, but that's super similar to what is already happening. Yeah.
Okay, Karol, thank you for that. Jonathan, is there any further comment needed on that? Because I want to check our items as we're getting close to the 2-hour mark.
Yeah, it also may exacerbate the lack of symmetricality issue that Jacob was mentioning. If you
Which
jump
one?
forward and then back, the lack of symmetricality.
Yeah,
like assert will jump forward and then jump back exactly the same amount. WTMA, the linear version, does not. There is a difference, and that difference tends to increase the difficulty. We haven't analyzed the quadratic form to make sure that if you do jump back and forth, it either doesn't increase or decrease the difficulty, or if there is a change, that it's always an increase and always a penalty for doing the jumping.
Yeah, they're both approximations. So they both may have those same problems.
And lastly, if you, instead of using a linear function or a quadratic function, if you use an exponential function, then you get assert.
Yeah, I mean, you don't use exponential because you need to use approximation, right? You don't.
I'm going to have to go to text only for a bit. Sorry, guys.
No problem. So we'll have an opportunity to read Jonathan's text as it come in. Just going to circle around here on the where we are in the agenda. As I said, we're getting close to the 2-hour mark. So I believe we're at the possible solutions area still. In general, do you feel there's a need to go into the cost to the ecosystem of doing the change or not doing the change? Does that need to be discussed at this meeting currently?
I think everybody is in pretty much agreement on what the costs are. And because we've discussed it as part of some of the other items,
right,
mainly around libraries, wallets, and anyone that is following the difficulty and checking the total proof of work of the chain. I do think that we need to make sure that we get any document, hopefully reach out to imaginary username to get his document, the projects affected. And I do think that conversation needs to continue. But without that as a base or other research, if other people on the call do have that research, I'd love to discuss it, but it may not be the time to do that yet.
Right. So that's kind of where I'm going to go with this, because we're getting close to the conclusions for the meeting, and I kind of like to do a round robin on that with everybody, and I suspect Jonathan's doing a little bit of that right now. The calls to action are what is going to come out of that. I think you guys are all pretty competent engineers that are working towards a solution. So what I'm going to suggest is that there be a follow-up meeting to this in 1 week's time. And I wanted to see what kind of reaction I would get by bringing that forward. So if you could give me a little indication.
I'd be okay with that.
Okay. Nobody's saying no. So Scott, did you say seems okay to me as well, Freetrader? In 10 days for you. Okay. So Scott, maybe what we'll do is we'll schedule this around sometime between 7 and 14 days, so that we can make sure we get the maximum amount of response. How is this for time of day for everybody that's here? I get a thumbs up on that. Thumbs up. Okay. Okay, Jonathan said he'd rather be sleeping, but I think that's the case all the time, isn't it, Jonathan? Sorry, that was mean. So, and that's just because he doesn't get enough sleep. Plus 4 hours better time for you, Jonathan. Okay, now that's good to know as well. So we can work towards that. Could we do a round robin just to give each of you an opportunity to sort of say what you think the outcome of today's meeting was and go from there? And maybe I'll start with Jacob.
I'm not sure I'm playing by the correct rules, but what I would say in my small slot is I think a lot of the time and energy and debate will go into the the integer approximation of ACERT. And I would just point out that my conclusion from some of the earlier digs we did was that even if the approximation is not very accurate, that's fine. So that may not be true, but keep that as a possible claim in mind.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Amaury, do you want to comment? You happy to be here?
Well, if you want the honest response, not really now. For me, it's a bit late to.
Oh, sorry.
No, but not the clock, but like late. Like it's a month before the free state, and for me, it's a bit late to.
That's a very
do that right now, especially since like people have been looking into this for many months.
Well, there is, as you say, an opportunity, so thank you. George, any final comments?
No, actually, I don't have too much to say on the preparations for the hard fork, other than I think it's in good hands with everyone else.
Okay, thank you. Chris, do you want to give a wrap up? Chris, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I don't have too much other than it seems like there's a lot of people on the same page, barring some details, which seems kind of good.
Okay, good. Karol.
Yeah, I think we're getting there.
Okay, that's good to hear. From Freetrader, I think we are largely in agreement about doing something about the DAA, and I'm encouraged about Jacob's characterization of the lack of sensitivity to goodness of approximation. In terms of what I, and perhaps a few other like-minded individuals at BCHN, will be working on: 1, get ASSERT C++ implementation polished as far as we can. 2, get additional professional review happening. 3, derive an unambiguous spec from that implementation. This should take into account the numerical recommendations made by the paper. These might even need review. And number 4, make implementation and spec available to others to review. Anyone able to help will speed up the process. So that was from Freetrader. And then from Scott, this really isn't a different solution than what those of use wanted in December 2016. It's not a big difference. I mean December 2017. Okay, so we'll correct that. We had a WTEMA January 2018. Antony was quoting it a year ago. So,
yeah, I'd like to respond on that. This is something I already pointed in that meeting, but there have been changes in the way we select the best blockchain that make that secure. It was definitively not secure in December 2017 or whatever that was. And quite frankly, like going over that discussion again and again and again is a bit tiring. The feedback was already provided at the time. And if people don't want to be serious about that, they need to check out of the discussion because they're wasting everybody's time.
okay, and I appreciate that that comes across rather harsh the way Amaury says it, but I think if we were to review the words and the intent behind them, I don't think it's quite.
No, it's not harsh. It's not harsh because people have been peddling that stupid bullshit for like 2 years now and wasting everybody's time. And unless you consider that everybody's time is not valuable, but I do.
Okay.
So
we appreciate what you're saying, Amaury, and I think we're working towards a solution that everybody can live with. So I just want to keep everything on track. Antony, did you want to do a final comment as well?
Sure. I mean, I feel okay about the meeting. I pretty much said what I wanted to say. Like, I agree with Amaury that it's pretty late in the process, but I still think it's worth trying to like I feel like I said what I wanted to about like what we need to do to go in a productive direction. Right. And I mean, I don't know whether it will actually make it in for November or not, but may as well like try to do it, like try to point in the right direction anyway and see what happens.
Great.
There's one thing about that, Manjarian, is depending on how we activate this, we didn't really talk much about the activation, whether it's going to be MTP or block height based. But it is also very possible that we do, a block height based activation that is slightly after the official hard fork date when the actual DAA activates. This was part of the article that Jonathan put in. We didn't really discuss it, so I'm not saying that's how it needs to happen. But that does buy a little bit more time for the ecosystem to be able to make any adjustments for that. So while the hard fork is happening on November 15th, the activation for the block height could be estimated as like the third week of November or the first week of December to make sure that any block time fluctuations don't mess with the activation. And it technically could give more time to the ecosystem to implement the spec if we're concerned about the ecosystem having the time to make these changes. I don't think people are really as worried about the full nodes making these changes as much as the ecosystem impact. Because we do have a month if we want to implement it. I think that's possible. I think that at least my concern is all of the wallets and libraries and giving them time.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask Jonathan about activation because that's one of the specific things, but it seems like the meeting's long and he's on text now. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, personally, I'm pretty concerned about like getting the code into the nodes, especially ABC. I think that the timeline's pretty tight for that. So,
all right.
Okay.
Well,
I don't think that like I agree with you that like the activation maybe would be done that way, but I don't think that really like I'm still pretty concerned about like having enough time to do all the review and everything to get it into the node.
Thank you, Antony. I'm also going to just put out a message. And you don't have to respond to me here, but is having a meeting plus 4 hours from the start time of today workable for everyone? If there's anybody that isn't, please let me know, and we'll see if we can come to another compromise. But it would mean 4 hours later in the day, and I know that puts people in Europe into after dinner time. So. Jonathan says, leaning towards an NTP activation with an early reference block, example, a reference block from August or May. So what I think we need to do at this time, if you guys don't mind, is go back to the work group. I think everybody, with the exception of Freetrader, is in the Telegram work group. That seems to be the most productive of the different groups that I've seen operating. I would like to just clarify that not everybody here understands all of the politics of the things that have gone on in the last 3 years. And from what I know, it's not necessary for everybody to know all the politics. But what we do need to plan for is more cooperative meetings going forward. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for coming into this meeting today, acting extremely professional, working towards the future of Bitcoin Cash. If you guys don't mind, I'll wrap up the meeting now, and thank you very much for attending.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.